Okay, Minneapolis Foundation. So what are we? Okay, let's look. Oh, thank you very much. Let's look over here, cultivating change together. Okay, each one of those words means a lot. We cultivate, and when we say that, we believe, can you hear me if I'm not using this? No. Okay, good. When we say cultivating, it's very different than saying curing. It's really recognizing that there are assets in every community, and we don't go in and try to quote unquote fix a community. We go in and try to cultivate the assets there. Cultivating is a big and important word for us. Change is essential right now. We are not satisfied with where the world is at. We are not satisfied with where the community is at. We see the assets, but we recognize change is essential. Together is a hugely important word because some of you are here because you were contacted by one of our advisors who works with you. That's a trusted one-on-one relationship. So you're together in that, but what we really believe in together is who else is in the room here. We can work one-on-one with you, but the idea of you meeting someone else, if you saw me very awkwardly introducing one person and stranger after another, that is intentional. We hope you learn from what's up here, but we also learn from each other because you are part of the community of generosity in what we do. It's together. So what are we doing here? Okay, first, the Minneapolis Foundation, to simplify the whole thing, does a couple really simple things. Number one, we have money we control and we put it out in grants in two key areas. We put it out in racial and economic justice, and we put it out in reimagining education. We also work with fund holders, who many of you have donor advised funds with us, and we get out about $100 million through your partnership, and that goes all over the place. We spend a lot of time working with you on what organization can you give to. But I want to ask you a question. What one organization would you give to address inequities in this community and this world? And when you give me that answer, I will give you the one ingredient to bake a cake. Solving this problem requires a recipe. It requires us having an interdisciplinary approach to work across the boundaries we may have in our head. Education matters, but education can't be done without children's mental health, which can't be done without stable housing, which can't be done without employment. It all connects. So what do you do about that? Well, that's why we invented the OneMPLS Fund. It's really about the idea of saying, we'll give you individual places to invest, but how about taking some of your resource and putting it into a collected action to say that if you care about addressing inequities, put the money in this fund. That will allow us to move in areas that we haven't been or that we need to move into. Housing is one of those, and you'll hear about that today. But the OneMPLS Fund has been a real success, and we think it's going to grow significantly, much as your financial advisor tells you to buy some stocks, but also diversify in a mutual fund. We tell you there are certain organizations we think are effective, but so is this approach. And so with that, I want to turn it over to Patrice Relaford. Patrice is a real, incredibly important part of our team. She's now helping to lead our impact work, but she has from the beginning taken that very abstract idea of the OneMPLS Fund that I talked to you about and turned it into what it is today. And more important, put it on a path for what incredibly important work we're going to do in the future. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. I was going to say Beyonce. I'm going to turn it over to you, Patrice, and then you can take it away.
I wish I looked as good as Beyonce, but thank you, RT. So, hello everyone. I'm Patrice Relaford, the Senior Director of Impact and Collective Giving here at the Minneapolis Foundation. I know RT has a really great and fun job, but I think I have the best job at the Minneapolis Foundation, and it's possible because of my coworkers, our partners such as the three panelists, and awesome people like you all. So I'm going to get into a little bit of the nuts and bolts of the fund, and then I'll transition to introducing our incredible panelists tonight. So the OneMPLS Fund was launched in 2018, and we founded it based on this idea that everyone can be a philanthropist and that we can come together in ways that are nimble and responsive, and we can give together to address pressing needs in our community and also work on those bigger structural issues related to inequity. So we've pivoted with this fund throughout the course of its history in that We incubated it in 2018, and the foundation made an investment in the fund of $1 million. And we were able to raise additional resources. And in 2019, we launched this fund in terms of the grant-making phase of it with an RFP focused on housing. And we learned a lot from that RFP, including that the issue of affordable housing has so many tentacles, and that as a region, we have challenges across production, preservation, and also fairness and maintaining stability and affordability. And so from there, those learnings from 2019 have stayed with us and allowed us to have relationships with some key partners on the ground. But as you all know, 2020 happened, and we were very fortunate with this fund to be able to really pivot very quickly and address the emerging issues that were coming out as society closed in 2020 due to the pandemic. And because of the generosity of the community, I mean, within a number of months, we had raised more than $3 million and distributed to nonprofits that were working on frontline issues related to families maybe not having food, people needing support for rent before the moratorium went into effect. So just a number of issues related to the instability that the pandemic caused. And so then coming out of the pandemic, we were hearing quite a bit from nonprofits about the challenges of having really worked very hard with their staff and their community to address the needs of the pandemic. But in 2022, we focused on nonprofit capacity. And then we've also focused too with this fund on immediately following the murder of George Floyd, addressing some of the issues with rebuilding in South and North Minneapolis. And so today, in 2023, we decided, we're hearing quite a bit about housing, especially as inflation becomes an increasing concern, and we want to return to that issue. And so the fund has two approaches. One, we do open RFPs in which we allow nonprofits to apply, but we also, again, seek to listen and be responsive. And so in the housing area, we went back to some of those partners that we had engaged in 2019 and 2020. And one of the great things about the Twin Cities community is how generous people are. They'll tell you what they're doing and what they're working on, and then they'll tell you about other people who they think are also addressing issues that everyone needs to know about. And so through that process, I don't know if you had a chance to see the revolving slides that were playing when you all came in. Some of those groups we had worked with before, but some of those groups, such as ACER, we learned about them from the other nonprofit partners. So you'll meet our panelists shortly here. I'm gonna have them come up. It's a little bit awkward as an adult to get in these high chairs. So, so I thought I'd go first and then give them the chance to walk up here. And so I'll introduce each of them, and then they can, if you wanna come up as I'm introducing you, I'm gonna kick it off with Nelima. But just before I introduce Nelima, sorry, I also just wanna say that we've learned so much from our partners in recent months, and we really appreciate the knowledge that they share with us. And so we do events like this to bring folks together and allow you to learn from nonprofits. And so you can work with us, you can learn directly from them. We're here to facilitate these connections and do so in a way that helps you to build your knowledge and also to build connections too. So first up, I want to introduce Nelima Sitati Munene from African Career and Education Resources. So Nelima is the executive director of ACER. It's a leading innovative issue-based organization that focuses on uplifting community-based strategies to address inequities in housing and other community issues in the North Metro, especially Brooklyn Center and Brooklyn Park and some of the surrounding communities. Nelima, despite how young she looks, has more than 17 years of experience in community and economic development. And she's been in ED for more than 5 years, but she also has deep public policy, community engagement, and racial and housing justice expertise. Nelima was selected in 2021 for the 2021-2022 cohort of the Minnesota Young American Leaders Program. She's also a fellow with the Humphrey School as a Humphrey Public Policy Fellow, and she's an alumnus of that program. Nelima is an avid relationship builder. She's extremely strategic. It's been great getting to know her over the past few months, and I'm really excited for her to tell you more about ACER and the work that she's doing in the North Metro. So next up is Will Delaney. Give Will a second to come and get in this high chair. Will is the co-executive director of Hope Community. He joined Hope Community in 2008, and he leads Hope's efforts to maintain real estate properties as assets in accordance with Hope's mission and financial goals. So if you're not familiar with Hope Community, it's a community development organization that's centered in South Minneapolis in the Phillips neighborhood, and they just have a ton of expertise. And so Will manages Hope's real estate development efforts and partnerships, and he leads their fundraising efforts as well. I also want to congratulate him on recently being named a co-director at Hope on an interim basis. He's just has so much expertise, and it's great that the organization taps someone from within to lead during a time of transition. And then in terms of his personal commitments, he's the chair of the Franklin Area Business Association and a board member of the Metropolitan Consortium of Community Developers. Will grew up in Ohio, which we won't hold against him, but he's a graduate of St. Olaf, and he also has a master's in urban planning and public and regional planning from the University of Minnesota. Thank you so much, Will, for being here with us today. And last but not least is our friend Ben Horowitz from the Minneapolis Federal Reserve. Ben is a senior policy analyst. Good job getting in that chair. Is a senior policy analyst at the Fed, and he leads their community engagement division. He is very fortunate in that he combines his nonprofit expertise with his research expertise, and he investigates and writes about policies and programs related to housing affordability, early childhood development, labor market institutions, and investments in low and moderate income communities. Ben has a BA in journalism from Arizona State University and a master's in public administration from Princeton University. Before joining the bank, Ben worked for a labor union and in the nonprofit sector. So before we start, I just want to give our panelists a hand. They are just so experienced, and I'm really glad to be on this stage with them. So first up is Ben from the Federal Reserve. And so as part of his response, Ben will tell you a little bit more about the Fed, but I want to kick this off with a question related to the Fed's research. So Ben, with housing being a critical component of economic well-being in Minneapolis, the Fed has made research and analysis of housing issues a major initiative. What does your organization's recent research tell us about the issue of longstanding gaps and racial gaps in home ownership in the Twin Cities and effective strategies to close some of those gaps?
Thanks. Thanks for the question. And thanks, Patrice and Maggie and RT and all the other Minneapolis Foundation folks for the invitation to be on a panel with these two community development all-stars and in a room with all of you very interesting people. And thanks to the staff at the Y for helping everything sail really smoothly here. I know I'm still getting my sea legs back on being around lots of people all at one time. So this has been a great experience preparing for this event. I need to start with a quick disclaimer that the opinions I share today are my own and not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis or the Federal Reserve System. They make everybody say that, for the record, not just me. So most of you are probably aware that Minnesota has some of the worst racial disparities in home ownership of any state in the nation. And when you drill down on that, white households in Minnesota are much more likely to own a home than white households elsewhere in the nation. Native, Asian, and Latino households in Minnesota are at about the national average, and then black households in Minnesota are very below national stats, and in fact have a lower home ownership rate than in 1990. So when people buy a home, generally they use a mortgage to do so, and the Minneapolis Fed has privileged access to some data that gets generated as part of the mortgage application process. And two of our very smart researchers, Kim Key and Katie Lim, use that data to investigate whether disparities that we see in mortgage approval rates can be explained by differences across racial groups and things like income or credit scores. So if you look at the raw data, which anybody has access to, you can see that white applicants are more likely to be approved for a mortgage. But there are also people raise, the fact that, well, white applicants tend to be higher income. They tend to have aspects of their application that would make them more likely to be approved. So is that what's driving this, or are there other things we need to consider? And I can't stress this enough that their work controls for these other factors and still finds these disparities in approval rates. And I stress that because every time we put out new research in this series, we get a slew of emails that say, well, of course, there's racial disparities. Different races have different incomes. Different races apply for different kinds of mortgages on different kinds of houses. And yes, that's that's what we're saying. Even accounting for that, you can't explain away these racial disparities. And we continue to explore this in a series of articles. Recently, we put out a piece that talks about the fact that applicants of color are more likely to be approved when they have a white co-applicant compared to having another co-applicant of color, for example. And this also lines up with other work that shows in Minnesota, once you control for things like access to wealth or immigration status, you still see these differences in homeownership. So it gets much trickier once you start to talk about solutions, talking about the mortgage access issue specifically. There's a national conversation around how we gauge people's creditworthiness and some really important discussions there. When we're in community conversations with lenders or other community groups, we tend to hear about the importance of racial diversity among loan officers and underwriters and people who are working with customers for lending institutions. And then there are also these group level differences that I mentioned, so things like down payment assistance or credit counseling that can help address some of these issues on the front end. And we try to track those as much as we can within our district.
Thanks, Ben. A lot of what you touched on, Ben and Nelima, Will and Nelima goes into the work they do at Hope Community and ACER. But one of the things I wanted to have you talk about is some of the national headlines that we see about the Twin Cities, especially as it relates to issues of affordability and then also issues related to inflation. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the recent national article in which we made national headlines over our inflation rate being lower than other parts of the country and how that contributes to our housing market, quote unquote, being more affordable. And specifically as someone with a journalism background, what did some of that national coverage miss about what's happening here in the Twin Cities? And then how does it relate to issues related to preserving naturally occurring affordable housing and then also housing production?
Sure, so I think as most people probably know, inflation is a measure of how much prices are changing. So it is true that inflation was relatively low in Minneapolis relative to other metro areas in the nation. And a large part of inflation is driven by changes in housing prices, or I should be more specific, shelter costs, which were lower here than in other metros. But that doesn't account for the fact that almost half of all renters in Minnesota are still paying a third of their income or more towards their housing costs, and a quarter of all renters are paying half of their income or more towards their housing costs. So we like to start off by saying subsidy is always going to be a part of the story when it comes to housing affordability. There are always going to be people who struggle to find stable housing at a price they can afford. And preserving what's known as naturally occurring affordable housing, or housing that's not subsidized but is currently affordable to lower income families, is a huge part of that. A lot of people don't realize that, and by some estimates, 3/4 of the national affordable housing stock is unsubsidized. People tend to think of public housing or Section 8, but in reality, most people in an affordable situation aren't there because of a subsidy. But the other piece of the equation is housing production. So there's a lot of really strong research that shows the more housing you produce, the less families experience homelessness, and the more housing you produce, the slower rent growth is for everybody. And in this nation, we generally give a lot of control over how things are built to local jurisdictions. And a lot of local jurisdictions use that power to make it very difficult and expensive to develop through what's known as land use or zoning regulations, where you determine what can be built where, but also really important details that can drive up the price of a project. So how many parking spaces do you need per unit? That can add, by some estimates, $20,000 to $50,000 per unit, depending on the kind of parking you're building. And in some places, they're requiring 2 spots per unit. So you think about that relative to what families can afford to pay. And that's where you get the phenomenon of NIMBYism, or not in my backyard, where more affluent communities with a bias against renters do what they can to keep multifamily out of their communities. And then on the flip side, I think you also hear a lot of skepticism or pushback on development in lower income communities and more progressive areas where people are concerned about displacement. And even though we know at a high level, when you build in any community, you tend to keep rent down overall because you're reducing demand for lower rent units. And the people who move into the newer building tend to be higher income, and so, again, reduced demand for other units. That doesn't mean it isn't also true that some families could be at risk of displacement, or some people could see their rents go up. So we have some work coming out that I'm excited about that will help us better see how people move around in the Twin Cities, which might help us start to understand how some of these questions play out with the local context. And we also recently put out a case study on Bloomington, who I think is a good example of a locality that tried to address all the worms in this can, or whatever metaphor, tried to be very thoughtful about considering the needs of housing producers, but also of tenants and community members.
Where can people go to access your research?
MinneapolisFed.org.
Okay, thank you. And so thank you so much, Ben, for grounding us in some of these issues. And so now I want to turn it to Nelima and just ask you to talk about how ACER works to ensure all residents have a voice in decisions. Because it's been talked about, local decisions are really important in housing, where it's produced, where it's built, how affordable it is. And so I'm wondering if you'll talk a little bit about how ACER works to ensure folks have access to dignified housing and affordability in the North Metro suburbs, and then also some of the key challenges that you all have experienced in your work in recent years.
Sure, thank you. So how we ensure all residents have a voice. So at ACER, we're a community-driven issue organization. So what we mean by being community-driven is that an issue-based organization is one at any given moment we're working on and addressing the issues that our constituency base and the community has identified as being the most important and being the most urgent. And so how are we community-driven? When we say we're community-driven, it's like we literally engage our community members. We don't knock, go to where folks are. We meet people where they are. We're having conversations at the grocery store, at the barbershops and salons, and really engaging people, to find out what is going on in the community, what are some of the issues they're facing, what they're interested in, right? And then we do convenings. We have community meetings. We meet, we meet with members of the community, and we have these conversations, right? Not just focus groups where we are talking, people asking people questions, but we really hold community conversations that are shaped by community members so that they can be able to express themselves and identify the issues that are impacting them. And also we hold town halls where we invite decision makers to come and listen to community so that they can hear from a fast hand from community members and also respond. We also do what we call strategic convenings, because we know that we have multi-sectoral issues, and also we believe in bringing different stakeholders. It's going to take more than housing advocates and more than people who will work on housing to resolve these issues. And so we try to identify who are the different stakeholders that we need to bring around to the table to have these conversations with community members to be able to chart a way forward. Because we firmly believe that it is the folks who are most impacted by the issues who have the best solutions, to the issues that impact them. And finally, one of the big things that we do a lot of education. We educate, the system that makes the decisions around the issues and how they're impacting communities, because sometimes the best intentioned decisions don't always work. And so we're continuously doing this work to say that community needs to be around the table, but not just community being around the table around decision making, but what we have found out, especially in housing, is a lot of time even the framing of the issue is framed by, experts, right? And whether it's staff members, who are working for community organization or as housing advocates, if we frame the issue wrongly, I like to say, then we're going to get the wrong right answer, right? And so we find that for us, it's very important that, the community members are at the table to frame the issues, because sometimes there's some underlying issue that we don't know because we don't have the lived experience of the people, our community members, right, who are facing the housing challenges. And finally, we believe a lot in advancing policy, because we believe, policy is not the be and the be all, but it is a tool. It is a tool that we can use, and sometimes we need to change policies as our communities change, as our community grows, as people, move around. We need to adapt new policies. A lot of times, especially when it comes to zoning issues, right? You ask the question, why is this zoned this way? Why is this the way it is? I know the answer is normally, well, that's the way it's always been. And so a lot of times the zoning, the policies have not changed, as the community changes. And so we need to address that. In speaking about the challenges that we face, so when it comes to housing, a lot of issues are policy driven. So for the longest time, it was just, the political gridlock, especially the state capitol, was just so, it was such a huge roadblock for us to be able to advance housing policies. But what we did is we pivoted. I know sometimes the local government being in charge of housing can be challenging, but we decided to say, how can we use that? How can we use local government? We knew we were not making any advances at the state capitol for a number of years, and so we decided to come back to a local level and say, there's some things that you can do, City Council. There's some things that are under your purview that you can really start making these changes by passing, better local policies that can really advance, housing in your community. And one of the things about working at a local level is we organize our community members, and your city council members are your neighbors. You're more likely to run into your city council member, your mayor, whomever at your grocery store. And these are people that folks interact with more often than even the state legislators. And so we found that to be a tool, that we could use, that we started really engaging our local city councils in the northwest suburbs, in the cities of Brooklyn Park, Brooklyn Center, Crystal, and New Hope. And we found out too that it was such a great learning process for them. A lot of the city councils in the northwest suburbs are very part-time councils. They have their own full-time job and their family life, and also they don't have staff who are working on these issues. And so there was a lot of learning that needed to happen on their part. And yes, it was a lot of work, and the tenants did a lot of work. And one of the other things that we do is we do a lot of leadership development among our tenant community especially, and we like to do what we say, increase people's agency, right? If you give people the tools and the knowledge, etc., people are able to articulate their issues effectively and be able to advance changes.
Do you want to give an example of some of the success you had?
Sure. So I think one of the most important things is that we work on is preserving, apart from we advocate for the production of more affordable housing. We advocate for the preservation of affordable housing, but I think one of the big issues too that we advocate for that we found out was missing was the protection of tenants' rights. So a lot of times there's this narrative around tenants, especially low wealth tenants. They're transient, they like to move around. I know when we do the research, nobody wants to move around every year, but we found out that people were moving around because one, they were living in very unhealthy housing, and two, some of them were facing very unscrupulous landlords, and when they were advocating for repairs to be done, etc., there was a lot of retaliation. And so those are some of the things we went to the city council and said, there's some local ordinances you can pass to protect your tenants so that people are not moving from place to place. And the city of Brooklyn Park, passed some tenant protection rights, and also zoning is under the purview of city council. And I think one of the policies that the city of Brooklyn Park passed was about increasing affordable housing, so that if a developer came and asked for any type of concession, it doesn't matter if they asked for a foot or an inch of easement, then they would have to build at least 30% of affordable housing for that, for that development. Another thing that was happening in the landscape was there was a lot of flipping of NOAA properties, and just without notice, people would wake up in the morning and they would have all this, leaflets under the door. Oh, we just purchased your property, and guess what? You need to move. You need to leave. We're not going to renew your lease. And so we said, how do we protect, people in our community? And so the city of Brooklyn Park also passed an ordinance to say that any property owner, you're free to sell your property, but you have to give the city 30-day notice. And what that resulted in, for example, we had an apartment building in Brooklyn Park, the Huntington Place, and the owner we had a problem landlord. He had owned the property for about 25 years, had not invested a single cent in it, was not repairing it, and the tenants were living in very unhealthy conditions. And so when they began advocating for themselves, he was planning to sell it. He was planning to sell it to some outside investors who were planning to flip it. And the Huntington Place is the second largest apartment community in Minnesota. It has 844 units. It is housing of almost 3,500 to 4,000 people, which is a third of the city's population. And so overnight, a third of the population in Brooklyn Park was going to be displaced. And so we got the tenants together and did a lot of advocacy, and we actually challenged, we worked with the city council and challenged the owner of the property to sell it to a mission-based buyer. And so Aon purchased the property, and we were able to preserve the housing, and prevent a third of the population of the city of Brooklyn Park from being displaced. Right, and that took a lot of work, and it also took cooperation from the city of Brooklyn Park, because the city of Brooklyn Park also invested $25 million to help, Aon purchase that property. And so that's one of the great examples of how community and folks who were impacted by the issue and housing advocates, we would not have been able to come up to those solutions if we had not engaged the tenants in the conversation.
Thank you, Nelima. Wow, that's a big win with Aon purchasing that building. Thank you. I want to shift to Will, who your work is grounded in South Minneapolis. And we know South Minneapolis has dealt with multiple challenges, especially since the murder of George Floyd, and also more recently with issues related to homeless encampments. From Hope's perspective, what are the biggest barriers for renters and homeowners in South Minneapolis in terms of creating thriving, inclusive, and accessible neighborhoods?
Well, thank you. Thanks, Patrice. Thanks for having me here. It's great to be on this panel. Appreciate your support and having the opportunity to talk. So for those who know Hope Community,
There you go.
thank you. The light was on. I thought it was on. Hope Community, we're located at the corner of Franklin and Portland. If you've ever been by that intersection, you've seen our work. And if you don't mind, I'll just kind of go back. Obviously, there's a lot of challenges the last few years, but to really put it in context, I think the history of Phillips is actually quite important to kind of understand both where Hope's work grows out of and where we are now and where we're going. So Phillips, as many know, is a kind of historic community. It's a historic landing place for new arrivals to the city. Both the Norway House, Norwegian Cultural Institute, is on Franklin Avenue, and the American Swedish Institute is around the corner on Park Avenue, both right down the street from Hope. The building stock in Phillips goes back, 100 plus years. You find many buildings from 1880s, 1890s, 1900s. Older housing stock. It's a very historic part of the city. But starting in around the 1950s, as Phillips was one of the places where the city really started diversifying. If you look back in old census data, you'll see that Minneapolis was almost entirely white or classified as white up until about that time. Again, even though we are on Dakota land, the folks who were living here at the time were predominantly white. But starting about the 1950s and 1960s, it really started to diversify, especially in Phillips. So if you look today, Phillips is actually one of the most diverse neighborhoods in the entire state, I really would think. And when I say diverse, what I mean is quite literally, if you had a pie chart, 20% white, 25% Latino, Latina, 28% black, including a large, especially East African population. It's the home of the American Indian Cultural Corridor, and Little Earth of United Tribes is one of the largest urban American Indian populations in the country. It's incredibly diverse. And so, as Ben's research should alert us to, it's kind of no surprise, unfortunately, that starting at about the time that Phillips was really diversifying is about the time you saw massive disinvestment from the Phillips community, starting in the 1950s and 60s. We all know the history of I-94 through Rondo. The same thing happened with I-35 and I-94 in Minneapolis if you look at where those freeways are routed, right at the edge of the Phillips community. You can look back and see exactly where that is. So that type of investment started. You saw lots of pullback from the private sector, from the public sector, so that as Hope was doing, Hope started in 1977, but by the time Hope was doing some work in the early 1990s, I believe there were something like 400 vacant city-owned buildings just in the Phillips neighborhood in the early 1990s. Don't fact check me on that, but it's something like that. But essentially, it was really a symptomatic of, again, large-scale disinvestment from a community that. But that didn't mean there weren't people still living in that community, people who wanted to live in that community, who wanted to be in that community. So fast forward to today and the problems you're mentioning, which is the uprising after George Floyd's murder. You have the issue of a really perpetual thorny issue around unhoused folks, forming encampments. Where do they go? The thing is, the Wall of Forgotten Natives, which was actually pre-pandemic, and we thought we learned some lessons from that with the city response and where we were going to go as a city and a county and a state. Unfortunately, we are back in a very cyclical thing. And actually, if you look back even further, there's groups on Franklin Avenue, some wonderful partners of ours, such as like American Indian Community Development Center. AICDC got their start back in the 1980s because of the problem of unsheltered American Indian folks who were having to live in tents and on the street along Franklin Avenue. So unfortunately, it's one of those things where history keeps repeating itself because we're not really learning the lessons. So with that said, I think some of the challenges really facing folks today are similar in that, again, underinvestment, particularly in black and brown folks in our communities, turns up certainly for homeowners in the neighborhood. Phillips is also, though, it's 80+% renter of the households within the Phillips community. What we have seen, while there's a pretty decent stock, including hopes of long-term affordable housing that is meant to kind of not price people out, that's meant to not push people out, there is still privately owned, there are still other, kind of the NOAA, naturally occurring affordable housing that Ben talked about, that people have seen massive rent increases over time, and particularly there, over the last few years, there's been a huge run-up in people's rents. And so those are all pressures. It makes people really uncertain. It makes people, we know there's bad health outcomes for folks from instability and potential instability. We do a lot of engagement with folks, and I'll talk more about that in a second, but we hear all the time, even when we're talking about other issues, fears of gentrification, fears of displacement are constant for folks in neighborhoods like Phillips, and certainly in our neighborhood. And then you layer that onto the other kinds of disinvestment, pollution, environmental justice issues. We have, a foundry in Phillips. We have the freeways. We have, there's fights right now over the city public works in East Phillips. Those are again things that have historical resonance that keep happening. And so, as far as the issues, I just want to couch it in that because I think, yes, there are some unique ones, and so many of them have long tails that go back decades. So, if I could pivot a little bit from your question, I'll just talk quickly about how Hope has approached our work over the decades. So again, Hope started in 1977 in a red house just down Portland Avenue from Franklin Avenue. It was originally founded by a couple of amazing and radical Sisters of St. Joseph, those wonderful radical Catholic nuns who started it as a kind of Dorothy Day style Catholic worker shelter for women and kids. Because in the late 1970s, homelessness, we don't have a homeless problem in Minneapolis. That's not really an issue. It was before a lot of the other amazing shelters and a lot of that response network was there. So they really started it to meet a community need. But what was truly incredible about the women, and Hope has always been run by women until me, so I feel very awkward being an interim co-executive director. We've always been led by amazing women over the years. The women who ran the place were really clear about services are great, social services are important, but that's not where Hope stops. It's really about, just like Nelima said, listening to and engaging with the people in the community. And so through that, shaping what is our response, what do we do? And it's not that, oh, this is what we do and you go here, but really how do we build, and what happened over the years is through that listening, through that engagement, moving away from just the shelter model, because there were other shelters that popped up, and really moving to, hey, when folks leave the shelter, they're facing all these systemic challenges that there's not decent, affordable housing for them to go to. And they're going to end up right back on our doorstep unless we do some more systemic, community-level solution. Not that individual-level outcomes aren't important, but we need to do some bigger stuff, so really having a kind of a comprehensive community development focus. So over the years, Hope, we really talk about our work at all those levels, the individual level, the community level, and the systems level. Both people and place, so we've redeveloped, including with partnerships, groups such as AON, the City of Lakes Community Land Trust, to redevelop the four corners of Franklin and Portland. We now have 300 plus units of affordable housing, both rental and ownership. But we also have all of this community engagement, community organizing, community building work that keeps continually shaping what we're doing, because without that listening, our work, I feel like, wouldn't be guided the way it needs to be.
What's the most innovative thing that you guys, if you had to pick one, that you guys have done in the past 5 years?
Just one? Okay. Well, so since we're here in the context of housing, what I do want to talk about is our work around community ownership, which is the work that you all supported. Patrice just, has been a great supporter. You all supported us in that previous round when we just had an idea of what to do, which was really based on the community listening, and it was really around the idea that whoever controls the land gets to make the decisions, right? So how do we keep supporting in a community that's majority renter? Hope by ourselves as an organization can't necessarily be the ones to own all the properties, nor should we, because we don't need to just own everything in the city. But actually there's a lot of capacity and a lot of power within community. How could we support, frankly, not new models, really an old model of something like owner-occupant landlords? So folks in community being able, because one of the things Phillips has is a ton of duplexes, triplexes, small multifamily buildings. And we were recognizing, those are challenging for anybody to own and operate. They tend to be operated either by, frankly, for-profit landlords who aren't going to invest a lot of money in it, just as Nelima described with bigger complexes, is very true in those small multifamily buildings, because the way you cash flow them is you don't make repairs, and you charge people money, and lots of money, and you keep increasing their rent, and you keep flipping people in and out. The other folks who do it are folks like ourselves or other partners like AON, Common Bond, PPL. There's a lot of great nonprofit affordable housing providers, but we're all really stretched with those because you don't have economies of scale with that. You have lots of different roofs and boilers and all those kinds of things. It's really challenging to run. But what we looked at is at a community scale, we had lots of examples, folks in community who had experience. My aunt used to own a duplex, and I lived on the other side, and she kept it affordable. We know that does a lot of things when you have community level ownership, so that instead of investor owner and investor returns being the priority in housing, what about community focus? Folks can have a little chance to build wealth for themselves, build wealth for their community, and really framing it as community wealth building through a community ownership program. So I can talk more about that, but maybe I'll pause there.
Thank you. I want to turn it back to Nelima and talk a little bit. You mentioned some of this narrative and misconceptions. When you think about the misconceptions around housing for people in Brooklyn Park, Brooklyn Center, and some of the other North Metro communities, have these misconceptions continue to influence what happens there in terms of housing? And could you talk a little bit about who those misconceptions benefit, and then like how we disrupt some of them in the North Metro and across the region?
Sure. So one of the main misconceptions in the Northwest suburbs is that we have too much affordable housing, which we don't. We don't. What the research Ben was talking about is very true in the community. Renters are spending at least, for tenants, they're spending at least 50% of their income. And, and especially for folks who are low wealth, they're easily spending 50, 60% of their rent, of their income on rent. And so how can that be affordable? And it's something that, in the past years we've had to tussle, with our city councils about. The city of Brooklyn Park did not, before we started our work, the city of Brooklyn Park had not allowed any construction of apartment buildings for over 25 years. They had not allowed that to happen in a long time because of this misconception that we had too much affordable housing on the Zen corridor. So I'm not a big fan of the term NOR, of naturally occurring affordable housing, because there's nothing natural about affordable housing, because this is what naturally occurring affordable housing is. It is simply housing that the landlord has really not invested in, in making, in keeping up. And that is why, they're charging kind of lower rents. And to be honest, when we look at the rent rolls, they're not that cheap. The rent is not that cheap either, right? So that's one. So a lot of times people are counting this so-called naturally occurring affordable housing, which is really dilapidated housing that landlords have refused to reinvest in, and they're allowing people to live, in dilapidated housing. That's one. And so a few years ago, when we started seeing the flipping of properties, those are some of the first properties that are so easy to flip. And so if we're counting them as affordable housing, we are really allowing ourselves to be super deficient, in affordable housing, in affordable housing units. So, and also that is what builds the negative narrative around affordable housing. So when you talk of that, people don't even want to say affordable housing. People want to call it workforce housing. People want to call it, housing for coaches and teachers. That's what I hear in the suburbs, Yeah, and so, because naturally occurring affordable housing just means there's no public subsidy that went into it. And so there's no guarantee that it's going to remain affordable. And also, when we have the real affordable housing, it is well built, number one. Number two, the real affordable housing where we have public subsidies comes with a lot of protections, for tenants, around the affordability of the rent, if the landlord sells, or if the tenants need to move, about making sure that the tenants are relocated and have funds to relocate, right? And the other misconception, and so what that happens is the conversation around the Northwest suburbs that we have too much affordable housing, and that the challenges that we face in housing is because we have too many people of color, especially too many Black people, living together. So people talk about this tipping point, right? That we shouldn't have more than 30% of, that when we have communities that have at least 30% of people of color living together, then it becomes a poor community, right? As if the problem is because people of color, chose to live together. And so as an immigrant myself, I will tell you, one of the biggest things that you lose as an immigrant moving to a new country is that social capital. And there's a reason why we choose to live together in our communities, right? Because when people don't have a lot of money, then they have that social capital where they can help each other and pull their resources together and be able to build, healthier communities. And the other thing I will say is places do not get discriminated against, people get discriminated against. So the problem is not because we have 30% or more of people living together. The problem, as Ben mentioned and Will has mentioned, is the disinvestment that happens. So I think the question we need to be asking is, why does disinvestment happen when people of color choose to live together? So that's the real issue that we need to be addressing, and not talking about deconcentrating poverty. Because to me, deconcentrating poverty means that you're not solving the poverty issue. You're just diluting the poverty so that everybody can have their little share of poverty in different places, but people are still poor, and you haven't helped them, right? So, we need to debunk these myths and really need to dig in so that we can really, start having a root cause analysis of what is really wrong with our systems and what is really wrong in our communities. And as you mentioned, who benefits from such narratives? It's the people who don't want to do anything about it, right? Because if we deconcentrate the poverty and we hide it in all the different pockets, then it's not going to come up, right? But we are still going to have people in our communities that we are not, that we're not lifting up, out of poverty. And then the final thing I will say is, yes, the face of the northwest suburbs, have changed, over time. And a lot of times, a lot of the work that we do in working with the cities is because, yes, our cities in the northwest suburbs are facing unprecedented challenges. Our communities have changed over time, and a lot of times the cities don't have the tools to address, the new challenges, that we're facing. I think earlier we were talking with Mayor Ryberg about, the housing foreclosure crisis that happened in 2008, and we can talk a lot about the wealth that was lost, especially in the Black community in North Minneapolis. It was hundreds of millions of dollars, and a lot of those folks got pushed, into the fast-growing suburbs, right? And then when we see this other, wave of people losing their homes, it's the question we need to ask. It's the same population, the same community that are at risk of being pushed further out. And at some point, we have to put a stop to that. And that's why I'm very adamant about not having these conversations from a place, from a place narrative or a physical narrative. We have to talk about people. We have to center people. We talk about numbers and we talk about cities experiencing poverty. No, people are experiencing the poverty, and we have people, real faces and real families being impacted. And so we have to center the conversation around the people who are being impacted, or else it becomes very easy just to talk about places and numbers and cities.
Thank you, Nelima. Before I turn to our last question from me, I want to note that we have a QR code up here, and if any of you have questions, go ahead and take a picture of it and submit those, and then my colleague Maggie, I'll read those questions and ask the presenters to answer them. And if we don't get any, I'm brave enough to maybe just pass the mic to some of you. We have some, okay, good. So I want to do our last question from me to Will. So Nelima talked about this issue of wealth and poverty, and I want to ask you to talk a little bit about how you're using community ownership as a tool to build wealth for families in South Minneapolis. So would you talk a little bit about that and tell folks about that aspect of the community ownership work?
Yeah, so I didn't go into it hugely, but what our community ownership program is really about is looking at those opportunities within the small multifamily, duplex, triplex, et cetera, world, and what does it take to support folks to become owner-occupant landlords, right? So we started in early 2020. Our staff was literally going to go door knocking around the neighborhood the day that our executive director said, actually, I think we all need to go home, and like door knocking, this was March 2020, door knocking with like hundreds of people is a terrible idea, so we had to make a big pivot, we figured it out, but anyway, so we've been running since 2020 this program, which one big component is this training program. So we have now had over, as of tonight actually, as the next cohort is graduating, we'll have had over 80 graduates within those few years of this community ownership program. We just celebrated our 10th graduate who was able to purchase post training, which is really awesome. And then, so that's all about giving folks, at that individual level again, support and ongoing support around a journey towards, hey, this is a viable path. There are resources out here. We're going to help you find them, because becoming an owner-occupant of a duplex is not like something that everybody knows how to do. The people who know how to buy duplexes tend to be like investors who know what they're doing and like have access to lots of capital. And folks in community who might have a landlord who's going to sell their building would have no idea what to do about it without some support and resources. So again, when we talk about investing in community, that's one very direct way. But in addition, one of the things we've been doing, and it was intentional from the beginning, is learning what does it take, and what are the resources out there, and where are there gaps, and how can we, as a nonprofit organization who's got 40 plus years of a track record, has connections to funders and other folks, help create more resources and create better systems. So again, back to that systems level work, so that it is in fact easier, and that we can in fact prioritize community ownership over, say, investors coming in and buying up this housing stock and charging whatever rents they want. And actually, we think it's a better community level solution because it produces more folks who are invested in their community, folks who have a chance to build wealth. But one of the things we heard a lot in our listening with people was that they're very interested in building wealth for themselves and their families and intergenerational wealth, but they also really resonated with this idea of community wealth. That yes, I want to be able to have a great place for me, but I also want to rent out an apartment affordably, because I know I am a renter. I know what it's like to have your rent go up all the time, and so I want to actually have it be that somebody can afford to live there. And so that's just been really wonderful to see and to have folks get into that. And I just want to again root it back in what I said earlier, which is that listening work that Hope did. Just to put it on a finer point on it, Hope's whole work from the 1990s onward was really shaped by some pivotal listening with hundreds and actually over 1,000 folks from the Phillips community in the early 1990s. Talked about what they thought about the neighborhood, their hopes and their fears and all these kinds of things. What folks said over and over is, we don't like crime and drugs and bad properties, which Phillips had a lot of, but we do like that it's diverse, that we have, as Nelima expressed, for a lot of immigrant families, for families in a mainly white state, there's people who look like me, there's family, there's resources, there's social capital here. So folks really wanted to be there, they just wanted better housing and better conditions. But what people said over and over was this theme of, well, we think the neighborhood will get better because it's so close to downtown, because it's got all these amenities, but it won't be for people like us. So even if folks don't use the word gentrification or use the word displacement, they understand, people are smart, they understand that that's kind of how the market works, right? As neighborhoods get more investment, it's typically not for low income and low wealth folks. It is typically for people who can pay more, and so folks, as Nelima described, get pushed to the next poor neighborhood. So that's really shaped what Hope's work has been all about ever since then, is creating an alternative to that. How do you invest in a place and invest in the people in that place? Not just the place, but actually the people there so that they can stay. And then now this, the rental housing is a really core base that we've built, but now this opportunity for ownership and wealth building we think is a really critical next phase, and we're really excited to be doing that.
Thanks, Will. I just think about both of your organizations and how you really have this asset-based frame, and then also viewing immigrant communities and people of color communities as worthy of investment, and just like that's an asset that we in the Twin Cities need to recognize and not try to spread out. So I just thank you both so much. I'm gonna turn to the audience questions from my colleague Maggie.
And I know we won't have time to get to everybody's questions, so think about this as the start of a conversation, and there will definitely be opportunities to keep the learning going.
Definitely. So first up from the audience, this is interesting, okay. With baby boomers aging, how is the housing industry addressing the need for affordability and support services for the elderly? Who wants to take that one? Want to take that one?
I will sort of answer the question. So going back to our conversation about inflation and land use regulation and the ways that certain communities are more welcoming to multifamily development, what we're seeing right now that could threaten the longer run affordability in the region is that construction of multifamily development is not evenly spread out. And that does limit options for people who are looking to move into a smaller unit or a rental unit from maybe being a longtime homeowner. as they age. And I think there is a lot of there's a lot of conversation out there, to Nelima's point about how people tend to talk about affordable housing as anything but affordable housing. I think projects that focus on retirement age people do tend to get maybe easier community buy-in, but you can also still see examples where they don't. So there's a developer who's told us a story about how a colleague of theirs wanted to build near St. Cloud, and they wanted to build smaller single-family homes with smaller lots so that people could move there in their empty nest years and wouldn't have to worry about as much uptake or all the work that goes into a home, especially in Minnesota in the winter. And the locality said, no, we will not let you do this, even though it was a home for, supposedly this demographic that is seen to be more, easy to pass. So I think these land use and regulation issues really impact people across the income, age, every kind of demographic spectrum. So I think that maybe that kind of answered it a little bit.
I think just briefly, I know, so first of all, one of the things too, we worked with the City of Brooklyn Center. I mean, zoning is a big issue. And so we worked with the City of Brooklyn Center to really, they started looking at their whole zoning code because they had never looked at it or changed much. And really did a lot of community engagement and community input. And I think, and one of the things that was prominent in that conversation is about, yes, the elderly folk and how do we accommodate folks in our community. One of the things that came out in addition to more senior housing was also this idea of multi-generational living. And so the City of Brooklyn Center looked into allowing, what you call planned unit developments, where you can either have a child purchase your home and build an accessory dwelling unit in there, or allowing more multi-level housing or multiple housing, in a lot, just to allow that multi-generational living for folks who are interested in that.
One more question. Do I have time for one more? Okay. So one more question. Will changing city zoning rules to increase density result in more affordable housing across the region? Who wants to take that?
So I'm not the researcher here, but I do have thoughts on this, and maybe he'll correct or say that I'm wrong. But of course, the idea that we need to get more housing is part of the equation. That is absolutely true. But as Nelima really expertly pointed out, I believe that more supply helps at a certain degree, but there's a whole swath of folks below a certain income, and I know this as an operator and an asset manager for a whole bunch of housing. The cost of running housing is gonna be more than what many people can afford to pay. And so no matter how much supply you have, supply and demand, simple kind of Econ 101 is never gonna solve for the folks who we really should be wanting to solve for, right? So the folks who have historically been underinvested in, the folks of lower income and lower wealth. So that's where subsidy really comes in. It's actually really exciting to see that our state put a bunch of money into housing this year, including rental subsidies, a state rental program, and this new metro sales tax that includes rental subsidies directly. It's actually a really great thing, and we're hopeful to see how it goes. It's not even out the door yet, so we'll see how it all goes. But the point is that is the kind of strategy we need to be doing, because while density and triplexes and zoning and all that stuff is super important, we also have to acknowledge that even for many of the folks living in affordable housing, it's unaffordable to them because their incomes are just too low for what it costs people to operate it.
I think that was really well said, and I think the way we try to talk about it is that if you're subsidizing housing with one hand, but then you're making it more expensive to build housing with the other hand, then the subsidies that you're putting in are not going to go as far as they could. And so the short answer is yes, that if we build more housing, all of the research says that at a macro level, again, this is not to say there aren't specific scenarios where we need to think about things like displacement or local impacts. In general, housing is going to get more affordable for everyone. If you build more, that will not be sufficient to serve all of our neighbors if we're not also thinking about people who aren't earning enough to access what the market sets as rents.
Thanks. So I'm going to wrap us up. But I'm also going to allow each of our panelists just to tell you more about how you can connect with them if you have more questions for them later. So what's next after this session? We want you to think of yourselves as a generous community and you're partners with the foundation, and so you can give with us, alongside us, or just give directly in ways that advance the issues that the One Minneapolis Fund addresses. We really see this fund as an opportunity to create impact through co-investment. And we also want to just remind folks that we have a generous fund holder who has done a match for the One Minneapolis Fund. And so they've contributed $100,000 towards our next iteration of the housing grants, and just would invite you to learn more about the match from our website, and feel free, if you would like to participate in the match with us. We also want you to think about the work of the grantees, the two partners that we have on the stage with us. But again, you saw the roving profiles of some of the other grantees, and then there are other grantees listed on the website. And just with each of those organizations and the panelists, feel free to check them out or ask us more questions about them. And that, again, is just part of being part of a generous community of supporters of work in the Twin Cities. And last, I want to give our three panelists just a minute to tell you about how to connect with them after this event. Nelima, would you want to go first?
Sure. Our office is in Brooklyn Park, and you can find us at www.asainc.org.
Yeah, Franklin and Portland, 611 East Franklin is our building where our office is. Windows literally right there on Franklin. Hope-community.org. I'm pretty good with emails, but calls, you're always welcome to stop by, let us know, happy to connect.
We're at 90 Hennepin. We have a beautiful building. We do tours. You get free shredded money. You can also find our website is minneapolisfed.org, and we have a lot of great content there across a whole bunch of housing policy issues. And I think all of our websites all of our email addresses are also on there. I'm always happy to talk more about anything we discussed today or explore some of these issues in more detail.
Thanks again to the panel, and just feel free to connect with your philanthropic advisor to learn more about this fund, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And thanks again for being here, everyone.